Welcome back, everybody. If you've just joined us, welcome to HEATSKRS. So today we're in conversation with intellectual property lawyer Kevin Smith. And today's conversation is about the geopolitical implications of AI on us as African people and African creatives, which is a conversation I feel is so crucial, especially because the world is rapidly evolving, specifically within the digital space. And oftentimes when things are considered globally, whether that is creatively or in the business space, things like that, the African perspective and narrative is always left out. Or if it's not, then it's very limited or primitive, or it just perpetuates systemic racism and the idea that Africa is just dust and rust. And we all know it's not that. So I'm super keen to hear how we, as Africans, as creatives, can take up space in the digital realm. So please give Kevin Smith a warm and fiery HEATSKRS welcome.
Hello, people. So this is an In Conversation, and I will be your moderator. I am Yalezun Juguna. I am also the creator of HEATSKRS CON. Thank you so much for coming through. And this falls into our live podcast series. So this will be both on All That Yazz and African film. And in my mind, we are starting recording in 3, 2, 1. Good people and fellow students, welcome to a live episode of All That Yazz and African Film, because you're going to be hearing on both sides. Today is going to be a very depthful and deep conversation, and it is an actual follow-up conversation with one of our guests who has been with HEATSKRS for multiple years. We first started with him in 2022, and it was still just the BAI showcase when we were focusing on IP law. We then brought him back again last year to actually start our legal conversations on AI, when we're not just understanding what the legal ramifications of AI are as a system. This year, I believe we can all attest AI is very much a commonplace within most of our lives. So now this is not just about a creative conversation in terms of looking what the creativity is, but more so understanding in a global context with everything that is happening in the normalization of AI. What does it mean for Africa and for us as Africans within the actual tech space, and what this means for us? So this conversation is going to have 2 layers. First, we're actually going to break down the actual landscape. And then from there, we're then going to try and look at what exactly it is the African understanding is. With me, we have, again, as Soki has very much said, a mastermind, a maverick. This man is, when it comes to copyright, when it comes to IP law, when it comes to indigenous understanding, this is what he specializes in as a lawyer, whether he's actually our lawyer here at HEATSKRS. He has worked within the Amapiano industry, he's worked for Netflix, he's worked across the board within the creative industry, as well as culturally for even just their just for cultures in and of themselves. He's a cultural leader himself, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself before we get into the full conversation. But without further ado, here is Kevin Smith. Can we have a round of applause for our guest?
It's a pleasure to be here as always. Thank you for everyone who's taken their time out to be here. I'm Kevin Smith. I'm partner at the law firm AGA Incorporated. I'm also an indigenous leader. I'm a chief of the Khoisan in the Northern Cape. So I specialize a lot through commercial law, intellectual property, as well as indigenous law. And that's where this discussion emanates from, is how we need to position ourselves, not just as Africans, but as creatives in South Africa and in Africa in particular, to take advantage of developments, not just in AI, but developments in technology, developments in geopolitics, to make sure that as the next wave of the industrialization of this world takes place, we are key players within that, and we are positioned in a way that Africa is not only seen as a resource that needs to be exploited, but we are an actual key player in the development of the globe.
So now to start this off from a foundational perspective. So I think a good place to start is to actually just give a understanding of the landscape when it comes to AI systems. So I think a good deal of us know, I think one of the main two, which is OpenAI, DeepSeek, Anthropic, and then there's also Google's
Google Mind.
Google Mid. Okay, so can you give us just like a basic breakdown of these actual AI systems before you then get into the actual geopolitics of the AI systems which currently govern the landscape?
Perfect. So as you rightfully pointed out, there are two major poles in the AI landscape right now. One coming from the east, one coming from the west. The west in particular is dominated by your Google DeepMind, by your Anthropic, and your OpenAI. And one thing we need to understand when it comes to the development of these systems is how they fit within the commercial market of the countries that they emanate from. So when you look at the West, and particularly systems like OpenAI, they develop more in a free market approach, meaning that the West sees AI more as tech dominance, and they seek to develop AI in order to dominate the tech space, because of how the economic system and how the economic market is set up. So they look for free market innovation. So the innovation there would come from how the system itself develops along technological lines. Now, when we counterpose that with the East, particularly with China, China doesn't necessarily have a free market system. So they are more worried about how the system can be used within the society itself. So outside of market innovation, what China would have is what you would call military and civil fusion. Now, what that actually is they use these AI systems in order to blanket them across the society. So you'll find that their AI systems are used for the surveillance of the civil population. It's used for things like state security. It's used for things like intelligence. And that, again, is a system that shows how the free market in China actually operates. It operates from a state system downwards. It doesn't operate from a free market innovation type of system. So you have those two juxtapositions. And because those are the two major players, the other smaller players throughout the globe have to actually either follow those lines or they have to fit within how that market dominance actually works. So we have two systems right now. One is the West, which is more focused on tech dominance. And then we have the East, which is more focused on a military and civil fusion.
Well, the purpose of this conversation, because I do want this to be more so an educational experience, I want to ask, does everyone thus far understand what it is that's being said or the things which we need to break down? Are we good so far? Okay, great. So so now that we've set up the two main blocks, being the Western block and the Eastern block, part of what even we spoke within our discussions as you were speaking about is the one would say kind of like the offshoots that have now happened because these now systems have increased, that we've seen that the EU has responded in one particular way and the Middle East has responded in a completely different way. Could we break down like what those kind of responses to now the development and the continuous normalizations of these AI systems have been?
Yeah, definitely. So with the backdrop of who the major players in the East and the West are, there are others now who are also coming out, particularly in the Middle East and within the EU. But the EU, we're looking at it as the political bloc as the EU. There aren't any specific countries therein that are taking the dominance. Now, when we start with the Middle East use of AI is more militarily focused. And the reason for that is because the Middle East has a particular connection to the US. So the US as a major leader, not just in global politics, but in economics as well, has used the Middle East as more of its military outpost for the region. So the development of the technology in that region is to serve the US's military interests in that region itself. Now, this is important to understand because due to the fact that the smaller tech players don't have the resources or the financial backing to actually compete against China or the US directly, they can only fit within the market as it serves one of those two major political poles. Which is why you will find that the Middle East has a bigger focus on military development of AI. So things like drone technology, things like facial recognition targeting, and that we have seen now across the wars that have taken place in that region. Most of those wars have been fought using AI technology. And the reason for that is because it fits a specific geopolitical interest, mainly for the US. Now, when you then move over to the EU, you'll see that they don't have a particular interest in the development of the technology itself because it wouldn't serve them economically. What they are becoming a major player in is the regulation of AI. So they've done things like bring in legislation that seeks to assist people with copyright infringement, data protection, and things like your data walls that are put up between countries so that your information and data doesn't shift from one country to the next, because that's a major component of AI in the first place, how they collect the information and where that information comes from, because most of these systems have to be trained on data sets.
Yeah.
And for the most part, you'll find that those data sets are scraped and they're not compensating where they get that information from. So the EU is leading in regulation in that respect. One thing we have seen that has happened recently, which I think is a major blow for the AI space, is that in Denmark in particular, they have brought out legislation that allows for their citizens to have copyright ownership of their likeness and their faces. And this is particularly to combat things like deepfakes, for instance.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that in that specific society, what their legislation has deemed necessary is to fight that particular threat. Now, it's important for us to understand that in this AI landscape, we have to not only identify where the development is going, but what threats those developments pose for a society itself. And Denmark has shown that in their society in particular, the biggest threat for their citizens is protection of the privacy of their likeness, which is why they've legislated to have instant copyright protection for their likeness, so that you don't have social media, for instance, using a deepfake of yourself or anyone else and not being able to litigate to have that taken down. Because we have seen in the digital age of social media, if there's a deepfake that exists of you on Instagram, it's nearly impossible for that to be removed.
Yeah.
So the invasion not only of your privacy, but the defamatory effect of that is almost impossible to protect. So they have found that in a social media age, it is most important for their citizens to be protected from that, which is where we as South Africans and Africans in general need to start thinking about what are the things that we need to be protected from, not just in the age of digitization, but in an age of AI in particular. So regulation in the space of us becoming a global player, I think that will be the most important first step for our development. Because again, when we think about the resource base needed for us to become a player technologically, that wouldn't be feasible for us right now. But what we do have is that we have access to one of the largest growing populations. We will have access to most of the internet users of the future. We will have access to the largest middle class of the future, meaning that regulatory, we need that protected.
But before we kind of move to the African context, since we're now speaking of like the European context and how it is that they're attacking it from a legislative perspective, how is that actioned upon, like practically, in terms of right now you use the example with like the deepfake. So what is the actual process? Since I don't say we live in a global world, but what then happens within those situations? Do you have anything to kind of like pull from if then a deepfake situation is used? What are the actual ramifications within the EU bloc?
So it's very simple actually. When we think about how legislation comes about, if we were to use the South African context, particularly with copyright, which is what's most relevant for a convention of this nature, we have copyright legislation that's domestic, meaning we have our own Copyright Act. But our Copyright Act is influenced by international conventions, being the TRIPS and the Berne Convention. Those conventions are international treaties that countries sign in order to have a more aligned approach across borders.
I would like to say, if you want more information on the TRIPS and Berne Convention, our actual first episode with the IP episode goes very deep into actually the TRIPS and the Berne Convention, IP trademarks and NDAs. Just a soft plug right there.
So essentially what those things do is that they seek to normalize the law across jurisdictions. Because if we have particular protections in South Africa that don't match the US, for instance, then it makes business between the markets that much more difficult. So the international conventions just seem to normalize across jurisdictions. But what we can do, again, like I said, outside of us having those conventions that are internationalized, we do still have domestic policy and domestic legislation. And that's where we need to come in, because it's just as important for us to comply with the international market as it is for us to set standards locally, because the international market cannot play in the domestic space if they don't comply with our legislation. So it's just as important for us to set those standards at a legislative level in order to make sure that we are not exploited from externally, which is what's currently taking place. So when we do have a deepfake situation, because we don't have the specific legislation that allows for us to attack that as a crime, you have to attack it from a different angle. So it would either be from the sense that, your information was leaked, which would be a breach of the Poppy Act, or it would be that I'm defaming you in some way, or a breach of contract. So you'd still be using domestic legislation from outside the realm of AI in order to attack the AI itself.
Because there's no current AI-focused legislation as it currently speaks of.
So the point being, just to round that point off, is that when we look at the specific dangers that AI pose, you can regulate those domestically, which will also influence the global market. And the reason why Africa is particularly important in that respect is, like I've said, we will have access to the largest middle class of the future, meaning that the largest consumer base and the largest database of the future will be African. So the global market will have to set itself to African standards unless Africa does not set its standards itself. So because we will be dominating on both sides, if we regulate early enough, the global have to be forced to align to our standards anyway, because we will be the dominant player on both the consumer side and the data side.
From a global majority perspective, actually, because right now Africa is currently growing to become the global majority. 7 out of the 10 highest rising GDPs are from African countries. So just to kind of give context, also when you look at the growth of speaking to our specific industries, when you look at the top growing listeners on apps like Spotify, on apps like Netflix, on everything that we're kind of building, it's within African countries. So as much as the purpose of even stuff like we're doing in HEATSKRS is to really showcase creativity, this creativity is our lifeblood, as much as even from the previous talk as what Usurper was talking about, our energy and our force within actually the global space comes from our creativity. So I think moving into the actual next part of the conversation, which is now focusing on where Africa currently sits, are we all good? Do we have any questions actually before we move into the second section? Anything? Any cool? Okay, Julian has a question.
Beautiful start, Yazz and Kevin. I'm enjoying it so far. So what I want to touch base is you get a lot of these file sharing platforms and a lot of companies that have utilized AI without telling their users. And now because AI law has become a thing, they're now introducing it into their causes. So what is your thoughts on now every platform saying, oh no, we use AI, but if you use our platform, we have the right to use it to train our AI? In terms of without giving someone, oh, but you actually did this before, but now you're making it known. What is your whole process behind that and feelings about it?
Great question. So let me actually take it back to the context as to why that even exists. So the reason why those disclaimers even exist right now is because of data protection laws. So it's not necessarily to give you notice that they're using AI. It's actually to give you notice that the data is actually being collected by an external source. And the reason is because large language models are built on data sets. Those AI systems can only exist in as much as the data that they have available to them. Now, in time immemorial, what's been happening is that they scrape data from the internet. So data scraping just means that they go through all websites, they take whatever's there, and then they sort it out later. That's done without consent and it's done without compensation. So there are two elements of the law that are being breached. One is data security, but one is also a contractual issue of not being compensated for information that you are receiving, because they will be using it economically as well. So those disclaimers now are essentially just to tell you that the information that's being taken while you are using it will essentially form part of a data set, which will then train a large language model, which will then be used commercially. So those are the specific elements that they're dealing with there. Now, when we think about the law and how we should regulate that, we need to understand that there's the commercial aspect as to what they'll be using it for, meaning that the site you are currently using is probably from the Western bloc of AI developers because they have a particular commercial interest. If it was on the East, it would be more for surveillance. So they wouldn't be notifying you in the same way. They would be notifying you in the sense that the privacy attached to your likeness is going to be used in a system that might be used against you in future. So that's how those two types of notices would have changed. So it already tells you where the company comes from that you are dealing with, that they might be either a US or an EU company. Now, where we need to come in as Africans is that we need to understand that the data that's already being used on those websites are data via consent because you're engaging in their system already. For the most part, African data has already been used without our consent. Because if you go to you can even go to ChatGPT right now as we speak and ask them to make an Afrobeats type song or write a script in Zulu or whatever the case may be, it will be able to do so. Where did it get that information from? Who has been compensated for it? So our duty is to ensure that we get things like our governments, things like the AU, things like the UN, to ensure that where any LLM is using African-specific data, that we have a system of compensation for the continent itself, either in the form of a trust or in the form of a compensatory royalty scheme that makes sure that wherever our data is found in any large language model, that some sort of compensation comes back to the people. Because like I said, when the globe is dominated by Africa, we also need to be catered for as consumers, meaning that most of the products that come out will be catering for an African audience. Now, that means that they will have to get more information that is relevant to us. So we have to actually come and intercept that process because we know that it's coming. So we need to be compensated now before we are compensated as consumers. So before we are entertained, we first need to be compensated as the ones giving the data that is going to be used for our entertainment. So we have to think about it on all levels: the commercial level, the regulatory level, and what that means for us as we are now and as we will be 10, 15, 20 years later.
I have a question. I just need to get your opinion. There is a disconnect between what you would call our legislature and people like yourselves and where AI is now. It's a thing of now and the future. The disconnect I'm talking about is I'm trying to ask you is how are people like you going to influence or can influence governments that have ministers who are plus 60, plus 70 years old, who clearly are not in tune with what is going on now, and you see it throughout. So as a continent, and as the future of where the world is going, how, and I will not say we, because I am part of it, but I'm old. But how is it, how are the youth and the younger generation going to be able to give that influence to that disconnect where you've got leadership that is totally out of tune with and not even able to listen or understand what it is that you're talking about. And the things that you're talking about are so key to the future of not only the development of the creative, but the entire
ecosystem.
Yes,
world.
yeah. Basically, I just need to know what your opinion is and how do you think one can overcome that challenge.
Thank you. That's a very important point, and the starting point to that answer is obviously things like this, where people like people like Kibbs bring us together so that we can actually get the youth involved in these types of discussions, because the disconnect first starts with a disconnect in education and a disconnect in information. Now, a deeper systemic issue is how the legal system in South Africa is actually set up. So the legal system is set up in a way where it is not proactive, it's reactive, meaning that we first have to go to court a few times before we regulate on an issue. So people would first have to take an OpenAI to court, a DeepSeek to court, before the legislature comes in and says that this is an issue that our citizens are facing. Rather, we regulate this issue, or it means that we'll have an overdraft of court cases in the AI space. So that's just a systemic issue that's hard to overcome, because it means that people need resources to sue and people need time to sue, which we don't always have. So that's a systemic issue that needs to be changed. But when it comes to the to the leadership issue, what I tend to do is, because like you've rightfully pointed out, we have an inherently old leadership that isn't forward thinking, I tend to bring these issues on the international stage. So I use things like the African Union and specifically the UN. But how you frame that is based on narrative. Because remember, when we use international legislation, it's more based on narrative than it is on merit. So the narrative that I tend to use when I bring those arguments across is to show that to the extent that we don't have these protections in place, it affects our inherent right to self-development and our right to exist in a global market as an indigenous people. So that argument at the UN in particular, there's this thing that they call self-determination, which is part of the UNDRIP conventions. Now, when you are restricted in your self-development as a people, international law then supersedes your domestic law. So if we show that the development of AI systems will be inherently prejudicial to us as Africans, then international sanctions can then be placed, because then it means that our freedom as a people is at risk because of these technologies. It has been done many times. It's been used in fishing in Cape Town, for instance, where international law is used to ensure that domestic and indigenous people of Cape Town actually have a commercial interest in commercial fishery there. It's been used by the people in Belize to make sure that their land is not dispossessed by government for the sake of governmental development. So even when the government can say that we are going to be developing highways in this land, the indigenous right of those people to that land can still be superseded because of their self-development. So what we need to do as Africans is that we need to start bringing these issues into the international stage. But the disconnect again at the highest level is also that the people that are being affected are not necessarily engaged with the leadership themselves, which is an issue that we have to place on our shoulders. That's our fault. Because at the end of the day, the decision makers make decisions based on their perspective of an issue. And the problem is that they have an inherently small view of what that issue might be. I can't, for instance, say what the problem might be in the film industry, because I'm not in the film industry itself. I may understand it from a legal perspective, because I've done contracts in the film industry. I've worked with actors, I've worked with, like I said, Netflix and things of that nature. But only a filmmaker can tell me that they can't make African stories because there's not an African market, for instance, but there's no African music to tie into the composition in the music scoring, things of that nature. So that's where regulation comes in, to make sure that the market players involved in the industry are forced to benefit us. So the discussion starts at understanding at the ground level, what are our problems? Who are the people that might be affected? Because when we see the problem, then we can start envisioning the solution in terms of the future.
Final question, and then we'll move to the second part.
I'm sorry, this is what you were saying. So you mentioned that our legislator is very reactive, but I think everyone reacts to public pressure. Is there anything that people on the ground can do to raise that pressure? But if it will be spoken about going forward, you can just move on from the question.
Thank you, Noat. I think I'll handle it now. So if you look at how our parliament is set up, there are things called parliamentary portfolio committees that deal with specific things. Some deal with sport, some deal with healthcare, others deal with entertainment. So we as the ground, as you mentioned it, need to engage those types of institutions. So the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Arts and Entertainment needs to be engaged on this issue. Also, the DTI needs to be engaged on this specific issue. Now, there's a specific problem we have in that the Minister of Sports and Arts and Culture is inherently not from the creative industry itself, which means that the decisions that he makes are more for campaigning for his party than they are for the development of the industry. I'm not sure if you are aware, but there was a sectoral determination that was supposed to happen this year. Now, sectoral determination, if you don't know what that is, right, is when they look at the entire legislative framework and they say what needs to be in place at a legislative level to not only protect the industry but to develop it. Now, that was specifically brought about by film and media. And film and media had said that because actors are being underpaid, places like your Netflix are coming in and they are actually cannibalizing on our talent. What's also happening is that the people in the film industry, they are forced to sign those types of agreements because domestically they can't make as much money from the film industry. So if Netflix says that you have to sign this agreement, these are our terms, it's either a yes or a no. There's no room for negotiation. So they wanted to bring in a sectoral determination to ensure that at a legislative level, we still have enough of negotiating power for our creatives to still be creative for the sake of creativity and not for the sake of a check. So what we need to do is we need to impose and ask for a sectoral determination to be done in the creative industry on AI itself. And that would mean that we need to tell the government these are the problems that we have and that we might be facing if an AI system like open AI, whatever the case may be, becomes prevalent within the music industry, the art industry, whatever the case may be. So again, it comes back to us giving them an understanding of what the problem is, because at their level, their perspective of the problem is very narrow. So they'll make a decision that's wide enough to fit their political ambitions, but narrow for the creative industry itself.
Right. And to add part of the second discussion, part of at least the second half of it is more so also what it is that we're supposed to be practically doing, which is very much an advocacy conversation, which is what a lot of this always leads to in terms of how to better advocate for ourselves more practically, which is something we as creators need to know from a legal perspective, not just from a talking perspective, how better we can speak for ourselves. So we've given, within the first half of the conversation, we gave a broad overview both of what the landscape is and what the actual active actions are being taken from the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, as well as the spaces. So within the current structures, what is happening within the Global South and where does Africa currently fit within this practically?
Currently, Africa is in a very precarious position because we're very reliant on outside technologies for our development, and we are also reliant on those bigger players for our infrastructural development. So you'll see in the continent right now, there's been a shift between power dominance, and currently China has taken the lead, not just in infrastructure development, but also in technological development.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the development of a specifically AI system, we must take advantage of one of those power players. If we think about using the West as our key partner, we need to understand that they have a very exploitive approach. So they'll be looking to develop our AI at the expense of our data being in their hands. When you see China's approach to it, China does this thing that they call technological aid for the Global South. So in the same way as countries give normal aid like your food or building of hospitals, things of that nature, China does that in the form of technology. So what they'll do is they'll come in and bring infrastructure for you to develop AI systems, either at a cheap rate or for the concession of mineral rights itself. So our first discussion or our first decision that we need to make is based on who the best partner would be for us. Because again, as we currently stand, we do not have the resources or the financial backing to become a power player ourselves. So we have to use one of the dominant blocks, either the East or the West. My particular preference would be the East, but again, the industry itself would have to make that determination. And the reason why I say I would prefer the East is we currently will have access to the data that they need. So whether they like it or not, they have to use our data at some point. Whether they like it or not, they have to create systems that appeal to us as consumers of the future. Meaning that our first point of call is to put regulation in place to make sure that our data is seen as a resource, and not just a normal resource, but a resource like our mineral resources themselves, which have been inherently exploited by the global majority. So we need to ensure that we can protect our information and that we can protect ourselves as consumers. Because what that will then do is, when the development of AI technology and AI infrastructure happens within Africa, we are inherently being compensated for our data also being used. So we are growing a capital base based on the amount of data that can be taken from the continent. That assists us in the short term. And then, of course, in the long term, when AI systems are created with an inherently African focus, the normal use of those systems become an inherent benefit for the continent again. So not only do we get compensated for the data, but we get compensated for the usage of whatever system uses our data.
When you speak that, particularly now in a African perspective, maybe using even what Usurper was talking about in terms of how he's approaching art, that would then be tantamount to like royalties, essentially.
Royalties or whatever system we may deem fit. Because again, the royalty system is something that was imposed on us on the West anyway. And because these technological systems don't specifically have to follow that line of reasoning, we can have a compensation system that's particularly our own. But again, the focus, and I'll keep coming back to this, is to know that we are already sitting on a capital base, and that lies within the amount of data we have, that lies within the amount of people on the continent, that lies within the consumer base that will become those people of the future. So we must be able to exploit those internally first before an external AI system becomes our mode of operation.
So then what does that mean now that what does that, I want to say practically, because part of what it is that we love doing here and part of what we want with as people leave is to have kind of actionable steps in terms of what that means from a actually moving forward perspective. What, if it's conversations, if it's going to the gazettes, what are the actual steps? Because one, you already stated that we don't have AI legislation, which also means that AI legislation will happen, but it means that we need to be part of that conversation. But what are the actual steps that we then need to be taking and need to be aware of as creatives? Because that data also includes us. So what does that realistically and practically mean in terms of what we should be thinking about doing within our processes, and as we're actually moving forward, creating, whether it's festival to work, what are those actionable steps?
So the quickest one that we can make use of is the consolidation of our data. If we think about the music industry in particular, there are things like Amapiano, Afro beats. Those things are now global as much as they are South African, right? But we are inherently not benefiting from their global presence. And that's because they've been globalized before we had monetized them. So what we need to first start doing is to consolidate all of our information, consolidate our textiles, our designs, our languages, our folklore, things of that nature.
So when you say consolidate, how? So like in terms of like, is there like a example you can use that shows what a consolidation would look like?
So a simple thing would just be creating libraries of these things. If we think about all of our African folklore and fairy tales, things of that nature, a lot of those things are passed down from oral tradition. So we don't have a centralized point to access them. They have to be accessed through people. So the information is spread from person to person. Now what we need to do is we need to codify those things and create libraries of them And those libraries need to be either owned by our governments or owned by a trust that has beneficial interest in our people. And the reason for that is when that information is then taken to a Netflix, for instance, for them to make African adaptations of our stories, then they have to compensate us for usage of those stories themselves. But when things are just kept in oral tradition, they can take them, they can then formalize them, and then they will benefit. If you think of how Disney even became a company in the first place, what they did is that they consolidated folklore. That's actually what Disney
and turned
does.
it into copyright.
Exactly. So what they did is they took folklore from all over the world, they consolidated them into a material form, meaning that they created cartoons and movies of them, and then they used the legal system of copyright for it to become an asset to them in particular. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We must just do the same thing. And that comes to African medicine, African stories, music, textiles, pattern work, everything. And then we just use the current legal system to make sure that we can be protected and that those are our assets first. Because to the extent that those things are not registered and not regulated, they are open for anyone to take.
Okay, so just to confirm, so part of what you're saying is due to our continent, because not just a South African thing, but it is a continental thing of us being an oral, traditional, part of what this safeguarding means actually means, first of all, the full-on documentation of that. And once that's then been documented, preserving it so that we can then build off of what that data means to us.
Exactly. So I'll give you a more practical example. And this is just speaking to copyright law in itself. So people don't actually know that you have automatic copyright protection. In Africa, you don't have to register copyright. You get that protection once your idea is in material form, meaning that it can't be an idea. You have to write it down, or you have to record it, or it has to be in some form of a material form. Once it's in material form, you get automatic protection, right? Now you can already see how the legal system does not benefit oral tradition, because why? Oral tradition doesn't put anything into material form. So to the extent that anyone from the outside comes in to exploit us, that's all they need to do. And it won't be seen as illegal because they will have been the first ones to consolidate these things and bring them into material form. Exactly. So these things have happened not just in entertainment. It has happened within medicine as well. Now, if you think about things like hoodia, for instance, that's a hoodia. It's a herb, right? That is something that is within Khoisan tradition. It is a medicine used by our people. And Big Pharma had come in and had actually brought that into material form, creating recipes, making medicine from it. That's a multi-billion rand industry. The Khoisan are still impoverished. And it's only because what they're doing is that they're taking current legal infrastructure and applying it to indigenous knowledge. So that's all we need to do, is that we need to take all of our knowledge, put it into material form, have automatic protections to the extent that we need patents or anything else along those lines. We do that as well to ensure that we actually have ownership of what it is that we know, ownership of our medicine, ownership of our stories, ownership of our pattern work, ownership of our textiles, because that's what's going to be the next race, and it's going to be on the basis of our data. I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of the Khoisan languages, there's only one lady left who speaks it. So what we're currently doing now is we're actually using AI to preserve that language. So what we do is we have the person speaking the language, and then you can use an AI system to translate it to other languages. Now, because we will have ownership of the language itself, any translation will be owned by the Khoisan tribe as well. And that's what essentially they're doing in South America, is that they're actually codifying their language, because current AI technology will be able to translate it to the extent that that native speaker can do an initial translation. So they will just have to do the initial, like, this word means that, this word means that, and then AI can extrapolate that into a full speakable language. But because the ownership is in them having actually codified the language itself, any AI system that then goes on to use it for translation purposes, whatever purposes may be necessary, is also owned by the tribe. So that's actually one of the easiest ways for us to start taking ownership in the preservation of our cultures. And when we bring this into how the UN sees indigenous language and indigenous culture, A preservation of culture is also a preservation of self-interest, because without use of your language in your normal everyday life, without use of your cultural practices, you can't exist as an extension of your culture. And we see this in South Africa in particular, where the majority of people here are African, but we are speaking an inherently non-African language. We engage in inherently non-African ways. So we can't even exist as extensions of our culture. And it's because how the system has forced us to operate. So when we think about AI, we need to force those systems to operate inherently African first, so that the system also allows us to remain extensions of our culture.
Any more questions before we wrap up? I think I have like 7 minutes left. Okay. Okay. I'll take this as the final question and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. I just want clarity on some things, Malanya. I just want to understand here. Are you saying that someone from another country can come to South Africa and find maybe an indigenous group with their own type of medicine that they invented? Are you saying that this foreigner can take this recipe and make it his own and own it?
Yes.
Yeah. Not only am I saying that it's possible, I'm saying that it's been happening.
It's happened tenfold over.
The fact that there's rooibos in the US is a sign of that. Most, if you find holistic medicines, what they deem now as holistic medicines or natural medicines, you'll actually find that it's traditional medicines that have been co-opted by big pharmacy companies. So what they essentially do is that people or our elders will have been using these roots and plants for specific needs, and then they just go in and use that as an active ingredient in one of their pills or whatever the case may be. But because they have then created a recipe out of it, that recipe has copyright protection. So then they use the legal system to ensure that that recipe remains theirs, meaning that the ingredients in that recipe is also theirs. So what they just do is that they take the legal system and they exploit us through it, because we are not doing it. Our people just know that if you boil that and you drink it, you'll be fine. But we are not making use of these things economically because we are not thinking that way.
Even processes which kind of we talk about GMO and how they were naturally being done, some of those processes were being done centuries ago by Africans and now they're being brought back to us. It's literally... Yeah, to answer your question, it's continuously happening. So to then wrap up on this, conversation, part of what it is first of all a continuous and understanding of documentation. But since we're not talking about documentation, the final question I want to ask before we wrap up, and the archiving, since we live primarily also in a very social media and social media era of spaces where there's a difference between, for example, owned media, rented media, and all of these medias, where should we actually be focusing our archiving on? Because I believe that since we're talking about archiving, it then becomes important to then, when you're speaking of these libraries, saying these are the spaces that we should, because then there's a difference between... Actually, do people know the difference between rented and owned media before? Okay, so just so that I can... the reason why I'm asking this question, so there's in media, the different concepts called rented media, owned media. Yeah, we'll talk about rented media and owned media. When you're on social media, like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, that is a social media as rented media, which means that if TikTok were to go down today, actually, if you were to post stuff on TikTok, specific things which you can post on TikTok becomes TikTok copyright. If you post a tweet on Twitter, on X, that is a rented media space. Whatever you're posting on that space, if that is the first space that you are posting that piece of media on, it is that platform's media. You're renting that media space to then put whatever it is that you have. If you build a website, or if you have your own blog, or if you have your own space from a digital perspective, that's owned media, because you have created that space. So if I have a website and I'm now putting my blog on that website, and that's the first place that I put my words on, and then it goes somewhere else, it is on an owned media space. So since we're having a conversation about archiving, and I know a lot of people use forms of archiving on social media, is now the reason I'm asking that question as to where should these documentations for archival purposes be happening, and where should we be focusing those measures on? Have I answered have I explained the difference between rented and owned media? Cool.
So in my opinion, we need to do it at 3 levels. We need to do it at the personal level, we need to do it at the community level, and then at the national level. The reason why you need separation between those 3 is because remember that there's your likeness as Yazz. There are the things that you have produced. So there's a data set that's particular to you that you should be owning as well, that you should be compensated for by your community and by extension your country. So what tends to usually happen is that the archiving happens at a national level, but then it also means that the ownership of that information is at a national level, whereas your communities and the individuals don't always benefit, which is what happens with your rented media. So we need to always make sure that as individuals first, we create our data sets and we archive them ourselves, so that there's an archive of my content, there's an archive of my likeness, there's an archive of my data. So if my data is going to be sold at a community or a national level, I get compensated first. Or if an international company comes in and their technology becomes commonplace within my community or within my country, I can still also make benefit of getting the compensation because I have ownership of my own data in my hands. Now, this means that we need to make sure that our data isn't always held in your AI systems, in social media, things of that nature, which brings it back to the point that we need to be creating those things ourselves. We need our own ChatGPT. We need our own DeepSeek. And that brings us back to the point, who would be the best partner to do that for us? So if one of the Western dominant partners is willing to create infrastructure of that nature for us, but it doesn't allow for us to hold our own IP and our own data, then that's an AI system that we shouldn't be pursuing. However, if one of those partners can allow for the infrastructure to be built in Africa, with Africa having a retention of its data, that's where we should be looking. But it starts with having ownership of your data in your personal capacity, then as a community, then at a national level, so that the development of whatever technology comes has an inherent compensatory benefit for all 3 of those pillars. Because remember, your data makes sense as Yazz, your data makes sense as a member of this community, it makes sense as a... Exactly. So through all of those extensions, you need to be benefiting. So we need to always look at it at all 3 of those levels. So even when we develop our own systems, the system must have an inherent benefit at all 3 of those levels.
And I think that is a great place to stop. Thank you so much for your time. I believe this has been an engaging conversation, and I will now leave to our host to tell us what happens next. Thank you so much, Kevin.